All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about something called amplitude. You notice that in these functions, whether it's sine or cosine, oops, I meant to write cosine for this, so you can see that it doesn't matter which one you use. The leading number is going to be some value. It might not have a number there, in which case it'd be 1, because 1 times anything doesn't change that value. So in the previous example, it was just 1, but it could be any number you want. That number will affect what the height of the graph looks like, okay? Let's first talk about what an amplitude is on a graph. An amplitude is the distance between a midline of a graph, so halfway between the top and bottom, and the distance between that midline and the top or the bottom. So it's basically half the overall height of the graph. So the overall height is here, the amplitude is half that. That number will come from that A value. So if I throw a number at the front, whether it's 3 or -3, the amplitude would be the positive value from that. So it would just be the absolute value of that number, whether it's positive or negative, so 3. So let me explain that with Desmos again. So if I go back to Desmos and I do y equals sine of x, it's got an amplitude of 1 because it's starting at the midline of 0 and going up to 1. Well, if I put a 1 there, that's the same thing. So if I put a 2 there, it's going to go from the midline up to 2. So that amplitude would be 2. And if I put a 3 there, it's going to have an amplitude of 3 because it's going from 0 to 3. Whether that's a positive or a negative, that amplitude is an overall vertical height, okay? Height doesn't have a negative or negative value. Height is just a distance. So that distance here, even if that says -3 at the front, that overall distance is 3. That amplitude is 3. So what's the amplitude of y equals -5 cosine of x? It starts down here, but that amplitude is the distance between the midline, which is 0, and either the minimum or the maximum. So that distance is 5. So we just take the negative off if I want to get the amplitude, okay? Now let's talk about what that negative does. All that negative does is flip the graph. So if I did y equals 5 cosine x, it's reflected over the x-axis. So that negative will reflect it. It will not change what the amplitude is, okay? So a negative just reflects it over the x-axis, doesn't change the amplitude. So let's talk about what's happening here. On a sine graph, if I do y equals, let's say 3 sine of x, that sine graph will start at the midline, go up, down, then go down to the min and back up and end here. That's one full cycle, what we call, and then it keeps going on and on again forever. If I did y equals -3 sine x, amplitude's still 3, and it still starts at the midline, but it goes down first, then comes back up, then goes up and comes back down. It still has that same overall cycle, but it goes in the reflected pattern. And that's true whether it's sine or cosine. The difference is sine starts at the midline, cosine starts at the max or min. So with cosine, let me do the positive first. It'll start at the maximum value, work its way down to the midline, go all the way down to the minimum, back up to the midline, and then follow through at the very end of that at the maximum. And then it repeats itself over and over again. With the negative, the difference is it'll start at the minimum, work its way up to the midline, up to the max, down back to the midline, and finish at the minimum again, and then repeat that process. The amplitude's still 3 in this case, or I could do 6. The amplitude is whatever number you put out front that's always positive, okay? So that just don't be deceived by the amplitude here, because if I do like y equals 3 cosine of x, then I maybe subtract the number, plus, or let's say -2. That amplitude's still 3, even though it only goes up to 1, because the midline shifted down 2. So instead of being at 3, it goes down to 1 because it shifts down 2. So that maximum is at 1, but the amplitude is still going from the midline, which is -2, to the maximum, which is 1, and that difference is 3 units, okay? So to summarize that, amplitude, if A is negative, it's reflected, but the amplitude will always be that number out front, the absolute value of that number. So whether it's negative or positive, amplitude will be positive. Let's try a couple problems out in Delta Math discovering amplitude from a trig graph. So again, I don't care about the shift up or down. I want to know, what is that amplitude? So if you look at the midline, that's right here at the x-axis, that's 0. It goes up to 5 and down to -5. Now it starts at the midline, so it's sine, but that highest value is 5. So the amplitude would be 5. We don't put y equals here. It's not an equation. It's just an overall vertical distance. So we'd say 5. Let's do a new problem. All right, this one's shifted up. Now the midline is not at 0, nor is it at 1. That's the minimum. The maximum's at 3. So the midline is here at 2, y equals 2. So that amplitude is the vertical distance from the midline to the maximum or the minimum value. So that vertical distance, 2 to 3, is only 1 unit. So that amplitude would be 1. Let's look at this one. You got to identify where the midline is. So the minimum's at -1, the maximum's at 5. If you count down 1 to 4 and up 1 to 0, and then keep it going to 3 to, let's see, 1, and then down from 3 to 2, up from 1 to 2, that 2 would be the midline here. 2, if I count up 3, that gives me to 5. If I count down 3, 1, 2, 3, I'm at -1, which is my minimum. So my midline is 2. So my amplitude will be 3 units because that distance between the midline and the max or the min value is 3. So that leading number would be 3. Good deal. Let's do one more. Okay, in this problem here, the maximum's at 2, the min's at -4. The midline would be right here at -1. Starts at the midline. So it's going to go up 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So that amplitude again is 3. Hopefully you get the idea here. We can keep going on forever, but the amplitude is just that basically that distance, half the overall vertical distance, but the distance from the midline to the max or min. Thank you for watching. Hope that's understandable.